Acts chapter 9 tonight. This is on the back of your handout from this morning. We're going back to school. Just took my daughter back, this time as a teacher. We're getting geared up for school, life-wise and otherwise. And so maybe we'll start off with a little quiz tonight for the young people. A little quiz. Are you animal, vegetable, or mineral? Which are you? You're animal? You act like an animal? That would be the closest to right answer, but one boy said, no, I'm vegetable. The teacher said, why would you be vegetable? He said, I'm a human being. Little girl's first day at school, teacher's making out her registration card, filling in the information. She said, what's your father's name? She said, Daddy. He said, yes, I know he's your daddy, but what does your mother call him? And the girl said, oh, she doesn't call him anything. She likes him. Teacher said to another boy, why don't you brush your teeth? He said, what do you mean? She said, I can see what you had for breakfast this morning. He said, what did I have? She said, you had eggs. He said, boy, you're wrong. That was yesterday. I'll try one more time. The librarian said, please be quiet. The people next to you can't read. The boy said, that's a shame. I could read since I was 6. Too bad for them. I said I would try one more. Teacher noticed during the Pledge of Allegiance, Johnny placing his right hand over his backside. She said, Johnny, do not put your hand over your backside. You put your hand over your heart. He said, yes, it is over my heart. She said, why do you think that's your heart? She said, because when my granny visits, she picks me up and pats me there and says, bless your little heart. Saul's conversion in our text of Acts 9 was instantaneous, but his transformation took time. As a matter of fact, he went back to school in 3 key locations, and there are tools that God used in Saul's life in each of these 3 locations. So let's study it tonight. We'll get a lot more out of that than a few silly jokes. The first place that God sent Saul after he got saved was to the desert of Arabia. And this is the school of Solitude. And the school of Solitude is a tool. Verse number 23. Acts 9, verse 23. And after many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill him. It says many days were fulfilled. How many days were fulfilled? Sometimes the Bible does this. It'll take a long period of time and sum it up with just a brief phrase. Like in the beginning of your Bible, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. That's not necessarily a long time, but a whole lot fits into that little phrase. A few chapters later it says he made the stars also. What a huge undertaking found in those 5 words. Well, in this case, in verse number 23, when it says many days were fulfilled, it's actually a 3-year period of time. And here's how we know it. Look at the screen at Galatians 1, starting in verse number 15. Keep on a-going. Galatians 1:15, but when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his Son in me that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood, neither went up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia, that's the desert, this school of solitude, and returned again unto Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter for 15 days. He spent those 3 years in this Arabian desert alone with God. And for 3 years, God himself taught Saul. Now, you study the lives of great men and women of God, and you'll find that each of them had some formative years that they spent alone with God. Even if they were surrounded by people, they were at a point where they felt like, get this, God was all they had. A school of solitude, a time where it's just you and Him. And in their solitude, God shaped and molded them. For instance, Moses, 3 40-year segments make up his 120-year life. His first third, those 40 years in Pharaoh's house. The next 40 in this same Arabian desert where Saul went. Just 3,000 years earlier in his case. His last 40 years, you know what he was doing. Leading the people through the wilderness, out of Egypt and to the promised land. Now, if you ask most people which of those 40-year periods of Moses' life was most important, we'd be tempted to say the latter, delivering God's people from slavery. But I believe it never would have happened without that middle 40-year period, the school of solitude and formation. Now, somebody remind me tonight, what was the last thing Moses did at the end of his first 40 years? 40 years in Egypt, in Pharaoh's house. What's the last thing he did before he went into the desert for the next 40 years? What did he do? He killed a man. He took matters into his own hands in the power of the flesh, and God sent him to the desert, and sand blasted the pride out of him. And he learned that when you come to the place that God is all you have, you find He's all you need. Maybe you're in that place right now, like God is all I have. Then you know He's all that you need. David, when he was anointed king of Israel, the reigning king before him, what was his name? Another Saul, a different Saul, became so enraged, so jealous, that he actually chased David through the wilderness like an animal, hunting him with a spear. Now listen to the cry of David's heart in his 7th Psalm, Psalm 7, verses 1 and 2. O Lord my God, in Thee do I put my trust. Save me from all them that persecute me, and deliver me, lest he, that's Saul, tear my soul like a lion, rending it in pieces, while there is none to deliver. Now there's a man that's down and despondent and feels like God has forgotten him. And then in verse 10, he says, My defense is of God, which saveth the upright in heart. You see, he learned in the desert all alone that when you come to the place where God is all you have, you find out that He's all that you need. A wonderful truth. Psalm 13, 1 through 5. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever, how long wilt thou hide thy face from me? And how long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? He cried out, Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest mine enemies say, I have prevailed against him. And those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. But I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. In solitude, he was reminded that when you come to the place that He's all you have, you find He's all you need. His faith grew the most in the garden of solitude, which oftentimes doesn't look much like a garden, but more like a desert. One more example, Jesus Himself had an incredible 3-year ministry, opening blind eyes, deaf ears, even raising the dead. Come forth. And the greatest of all miracles, saving souls for all eternity. But what do you know about Jesus from age 12 to 30? Pretty much nothing. Silent years they were. In solitude, in obscurity, working in Dad's shop. No doubt communing with God in prayer and study and meditation and preparation. And then at 30, he didn't come onto the scene and say, well, I'm here, you lucky world. He didn't do a direct mailing to all the synagogues. I'm available for speaking engagements. No, he went out into the desert to start his ministry. the desert of Solitude, alone for 40 days and 40 nights, fasting, praying, whipped the devil personally before going out to tell others how to do the same. He began his ministry in solitude and then continued doing that each morning before he started the day. Mark 1:35, in the morning, rising up a great while before day, he went out and departed into a solitary place and there prayed. Elsewhere in Scripture it says it was his custom. It was a daily thing for him. A devotional time alone with God. I have that. Do you have that? Let's all have that. I thank God for an education at Bible college, but let me tell you something. It's what I learned direct from God all alone with Him that really matters. And if you've ever been to that point where you're alone and feel all alone, in that place of solitude, let God do a deeper work in your soul during that time. Let Him do radical spiritual surgery on your heart and mold and shape you from the inside out, like a vessel of clay in the hands of the potter in the school of solitude. Saul came out of Arabia, out of the desert, a different man. He went in scarred with hatred and bitterness and no doubt a lot of confusion, but he came out the tender-hearted apostle Paul. He was old school when he entered, raised under the Old Testament law, but he went back to school in the desert and he graduated and he threw his tasseled cap in the air figuratively and saying, by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. He went into the desert with the Old Testament only in his knapsack, and he came out with the book of Romans in his heart and penned it. And I'm so thankful for that. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. In the desert, God used the tool of solitude on Saul, and He used the tool of suffering on him as well. As he went back to school, God sent him next to Damascus, and there He used the tool of suffering. Back up a verse from verse 23, and let's get the context here. But Saul increased the more in strength and confounded the Jews which dwelt at Damascus, proving that this is very Christ. Then verse 23, they want to kill him. 24, but their laying await was known of Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and let him down by the wall in a basket. Many wanted to kill him. Can you imagine how he felt having to be smuggled out of town, let down the wall in a basket like some criminal? How humiliating. And yet this is just a small taste, a little foreshadow of what Saul has ahead of him, of all that's yet to come. Look at verse 15. But the Lord said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must, what? Suffer for my name's sake. And you know that passage in 2 Corinthians where it talks about all that he endured in his ministry, 195 stripes from whippings and beatings, being stoned and left for dead, shipwrecks, imprisonments, persecutions, cold and nakedness, thirst and hunger, not to mention this supposed disfiguring disease that he had. You know, they say the measure of your character is what it takes to get you to quit. And Paul must have had a lot of character through the school of suffering. What does it take to make you mad? What does it take to get you to give up and throw in the towel? If Paul was a church member today, his suffering list would have been a little different than that in 2 Corinthians. It would have been something like, nobody called me. They didn't shake my hand. I didn't care for their tone. Or he stepped on my toes. Very different. In our text, it's back to school for Saul, the school of hard knocks and suffering, solitude. You know, there's some things that we stubborn human beings will only learn through suffering. Pain is a primary motivator, and we learn some of the best lessons through pain, through the low road. Now let's shift gears here for a moment. Fast forward to your life now. We're leaving this Bible time in Acts 9 and fast forwarding to the 21st century. God looked down and saw you like a diamond in the rough. And now what's he doing? He's sending you to school, and me as well. Sometimes solitude, sometimes suffering. He's knocking off the rough edges. His hammer and his chisel aren't always pleasant, but they are very much necessary. Remember, Romans 12:2 says he's conforming us to his image. He puts us on the fire so those impurities rise to the top, and he can scrape them off, and we come forth a vessel for the finer, a more valuable product. And isn't that what a sculptor does? Let's say a sculptor takes a block of marble and carves a beautiful horse out of it. How do they do it? They look at the marble, they imagine the horse, and they chip away everything that doesn't look like the horse. They knock off the rough edges. It's in the valley that we learn some of our best lessons. I encourage you to pray a prayer like this. Say, Lord, help me learn what I'm supposed to learn through this suffering so I don't have to repeat it. The school of solitude, the school of suffering. Then thirdly, God sent Paul to Jerusalem, and God used the tool of seasoning on him. Tool of seasoning. A seasoned Christian has some experience under their belt. Look down in verse number 26. And when Saul was come to Jerusalem, he essayed to join himself to the disciples. But they were all afraid of him and believed not that he was a disciple. Why did he go to Jerusalem? Galatians 1, which we put up on the screen a while ago, said that it was to see Peter. Remember that? In order to see Peter. Now, the word see there, you'll find the word see in the Bible some 1,400 plus times. 1,400 plus times the word see. And yet, when he went to see Peter, it's the one and only time that this Greek word is used. The Greek word that's usually used for see just means literally what we think. To go and observe, to see something, or to go visit someone, or to see something with your eyes. Here in this passage, when he went to see Peter, it's the Greek word historeo. Historeo is obviously where we get the word history. You could say Saul went to Jerusalem to do a history on Peter and the disciples. You see, Paul had been given the doctrine. God entrusted the doctrine to him there in the desert of Arabia. God had given it directly to him. That's why he wrote half the New Testament and all the doctrine that we are to follow by inspiration of the Holy Spirit of God. Paul had the doctrine, but he didn't have the experience. He hadn't been with Jesus like these apostles had been, these disciples had been. He didn't have the personal experience. He didn't walk with Jesus for 3 years like Peter did. He wasn't there when Jesus healed the multitudes unless he was observing on the other side, garnering evidence and ammo to shoot back at them, trying to convict him as a criminal. He was against him if he ever observed some of those things, but he didn't have the personal experience these disciples had. He wasn't there when Jesus healed multitudes, but Peter was. He didn't witness the feeding of the 5,000, but the disciples were. He wasn't there when Jesus arose. He wasn't even saved yet, but Peter certainly was. And so Galatians tells us that he sat down for 15 solid days with Peter and the disciples and said, okay, give it to me. Tell me the whole story. Give me the background. I want details here. Don't leave anything out. And wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall for that meeting? That would be something else. I imagine Peter saying something like this. Well, it all started out one day when my brother Andrew walks in and, get this, says, we found the Messiah. We found the Christ. Whoop. We did what? The Messiah that we've been studying about in Scriptures and that our forefathers for generation after generation, century after century have been talking about and that's never come. You're saying that he's here now, that you found him? And I can tell by your face you're serious about this. You don't just think it's him, you know it's him. And Peter says something like this, the moment I laid my eyes on him, I knew that it was true. Just by laying eyes on him. And speaking of eyes, Peter could say, I know this is taking a rabbit trail, but let me tell you about when I walked on the water and when I kept my eyes on this Jesus, I could do it. But when I took my eyes off of him, when I looked away, I would sink. And the rest of these guys laughed and laughed at me when I sank, but let me tell you, none of them ever walked on water. And Jesus could look into my eyes, buddy, Peter could say. Yes, indeed, he could see right through me. He knew what I was thinking even before I thought it. He knew what I was about to say, but he would wait and let me say it and then fix me. He could see right through me, and I denied him at his trial, and from a distance our eyes met. Oh, the power of that moment. I will never forget his eyes. Look at what Peter's done here. All he's talked about is the eyes of Jesus. And it's gone so far. And Paul says, wait, you seem to be talking about yourself a whole lot. Yeah, Peter's like that. Hey, you skipped over a lot of stuff. Let's go back. Peter says, okay, guys, to all the disciples, help me out. Let's go through it. Day by day, event by event. Okay, where were we? We were at Capernaum. We were over here. And for 15 days, they go through the events. As Saul histories them, he went to see them, to history them. Paul's mentor, Peter, poured himself into his protege, mentoring him. What does a mentor do? What does a mentor do to their protege? They just pour themselves into them. They just reproduce themselves in them. When I was in Bible college, I prayed for several years that in God's timing, he would tie me to a great man who would be used of God to pour lots of experience into me. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was asking God to let me history someone and get a jump start, a boost, a good start by tying me to a great man. And oh, how the Lord answered that prayer through more than one, but each one a great answer to prayer. We all need a mentor. We all need someone to reproduce themselves in us. My primary father in the ministry, my mentor, poured himself into me and taught me that we all stand taller on one another's shoulders, and taught me that my mentoring is not done until I mentor others and pour good things into others, and not just talking about a church or church members. but into others who can minister the gospel. He taught me to do that, and I thank God for giving me a ministry that does exactly that. We all need a mentor, and we all should be mentoring some young proteges. We should all find someone with more experience than us who's been at it for a while, who's been there and done that, and will give us the t-shirt. It's important when I give out sermons to other pastors that I'm not just giving them a fish, but I teach them to fish for themselves and teach them to mentor someone else. This is discipleship. This is when we don't just add, but we multiply. And so we see a great example of this in our text in those 15 days. After 3 years in the desert and all that solitude and all the suffering that he went through there, as well as in Damascus, and what he will go through suffering-wise the rest of his ministry. Remember, Paul was the one who said that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and what? The fellowship of his sufferings. The school of suffering. After all of that, he spends these 15 days getting this head start boost. Peter helped pull Paul up to the next level, showed him the ropes of ministry. He gained valuable experience as he was seasoned for the practical ins and out of the ministries. You know what else a mentor does for us is they will give us accountability, hold us accountable, just something else that we need. One more thing. You'll have to turn over a couple pages to Acts chapter 11. We're in Acts 9. Go a couple pages to the right. Acts chapter 11. After Arabia, after Damascus and Jerusalem, you'll notice that Paul seems to drop off the scene. It's like he just disappeared for a short period of time. Turns out, we learn later, he'd gone to Tarsus. Now, what was Tarsus to Saul in a word? What was it? Home. He went home. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly what he did at home, but what do you think he might have wanted to do at home before he started his ministry to lots of strangers?
His family.
Win his family. Absolutely. I'd be surprised if we got to heaven and didn't find out that's exactly why he went back home. It's nice to go home for a visit, but it's even nicer to visit together for all eternity. Think about that. You are going to be with your loved ones who are saved for all eternity, which is more important than even the time that we could spend together on earth. That's why Jesus tells us to forsake family for the sake of ministry, not in a negative way of forsaking our family, but by comparison that eternity and spiritual ministry is much more important than just having family time together. So he's gone back to Tarsus, likely to win his family to the Lord, and there he waited on God. And what happened next? Acts 11, look at verse number 25. Then departed Barnabas to Tarsus to seek Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him unto Antioch. He opens the door, and there's his old buddy Barnabas. It's time for ministry. It's time to roll. It's time to do something. Now, by the way, what else happened at Antioch? What happened first in Antioch? The disciples were called a name there. Christians. You bunch of Christians. They were calling him a name. You Christians. You little Christ. You all are just followers of him. You know where that got him? We're coming after you. They meant it as a bad thing. He brought him to Antioch. Question tonight, and we are done. Are you in a holding pattern? In some area of your life, do you feel like you're in a holding pattern? What's God trying to do right now? What tools is he using on you? I have to ask myself the same question. What's he trying to do? As I try to accomplish all the things that I'm trying to do, what's God trying to do in the meanwhile? When our efforts fail, when we hit roadblocks, when it's time to wait, when it seems that he's silent, when it seems that we're all alone, is it possible that he's got us right where he wants us in the school of solitude? When things don't go our way, is it by chance possible that he's got us in a school of suffering where we will learn the best lessons? Is it a school of seasoning? It's all a learning experience. Like Saul, it's back to school. Let's pray.